Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the conference. I hope day 1 yesterday got us all off to a flying start, and that in the evening, those of you visiting the city had a chance to take in some of Glasgow's vibrant nightlife, but at least you've all managed to get here for 9 o'clock, more or less, this morning. Today we have a packed programme again, and by now you will have become familiar with the conference venue, but if you do have any queries or questions, please approach a member of the venue staff or myself or one of my Law Society colleagues. And if you've not already done so, please see the social events schedule on page 34 of your programme and the accompanying persons programme and day tours on pages 35 to 37, which offer some unique opportunities to get to know Glasgow and Scotland better, and you don't even need to like whisky or golf. Now, to our second day of business, beginning with our keynote speaker address. This morning, I'm delighted and honoured to welcome Ms. Hina Jilani to speak to us. Ms. Jilani is a pioneering lawyer and democracy campaigner from Pakistan and has had a wide range of achievements and appointments both in her own country and in the wider Commonwealth and the world. She is an elected member of the International Commission of Jurists and has sat on bodies such as the International Commission of Inquiry into Darfur and founded the Women's Action Forum in Pakistan, as well as establishing the first all-woman law firm there and the first legal aid centre. She's never shrunk from the difficulties of campaigning and standing up for the rule of law and the rights of people under discrimination and oppression, having been herself subjected to threats, abuse and arrest. I can't do justice in a short introduction to the full list of her achievements, but full biography note on Ms. Jilani is in your programme. Page 8. Now, Ms. Jilani will give her talk and is also willing to take questions from the floor while she's up on the stage. So if I can hand over to you, Ms. Jilani.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here at this law conference, especially because there are several common issues that lawyers all over the Commonwealth countries are grappling with. There is also a similar history that we share of struggles and trying to make the rule of law a meaningful concept for our people, for the legal profession, and making it possible for judiciaries to perform their role in not just administrating justice and the law, but making sure that the law is used both for the promotion and protection of human rights and for sustainability of democracy. I will speak a little bit today about the expanding role of the legal profession and their engagement with the process of enforcement of law, enforcement of human rights, and for building constitutional processes and creating and establishing norms that make it possible for democracies to sustain themselves and to give strength to institutions of democracy. I have spent the better part of my life practicing the kind of law that has used law more as a resource to advance human rights. When we, as lawyers who adopt the legal resources approach towards law and law practice and litigation, are conscious that when we litigate, it becomes a part of a transformation of structures and processes that contribute to correcting structural flaws that cause impoverishment, exclusion, discrimination. We use courts to advance the rights of marginalized groups as a part of a strategy to strengthen their capacity in order that the communities are able to use the law to both mobilize and to claim their demands. It is important for these communities to work and support the rule, work for and support the rule of law if they understand that it is possible to make the law work for them. When I speak about the rule of law, I'm coming from the society that I do and the state that I do. It is very difficult for me to be very enthusiastic about the law or the rule of law if I had a narrower understanding of the rule of law. It would mean that laws that are inherently oppressive and are used as an instrument of oppression are a part of the rule of law. It is therefore very important that we as the lawyers community engage with people and demonstrate that the rule of law is a concept that brings in participation, inclusion, rather than in any way sanctions or sanctifies its use as a measure of exclusion. Lawyers and jurists who are concerned with human rights protection, including access to justice issues, are engaged not just with the laws and courts, but engage with communities. Make sure that when they undertake any action in order to give legal relief through the courts, they are making sure that the community is participating in formulating the litigation strategy, as well as making sure that the relief is not only for an individual, but has a wider impact. And if a successful litigation has taken place, the success can be used in order to give relief to others who are suffering under similar grievances. It is also important that we understand that when litigation is done with the legal resource approach, it creates a connection between law and political change. Legal resources approach involves strategic thinking and assisting the disadvantaged groups to plan their campaigns, including the use of courts as a strategy for change. We therefore, as lawyers working towards the advancement of human rights and the promotion of democracy and strengthening of democracy by the use of law, use the test case litigation method, aimed at bringing about changes in the structure by challenging the defects in a law or policy that impacts a large number of people. The legal resources approach means more than just precipitating social change through court-ordered decrees, enforcing existing laws and articulating constitutional norms. Public interest lawyering in this context means to practice law fundamentally in order to create ripples of public impact from individual cases and to make the litigation experience a source of empowerment. Lawyers who have adopted this approach do not practice alone. Their clients, beneficiaries, or partners participate in the process. In terms of the strategic approach, this has come to be known as structural legal aid. priority is accorded for cases that have structural issues and not confined to the individual's claim. Such cases involve not only litigation, but non-litigation strategies such as campaigns, awareness sessions, training of paralegals who live within the community and help the community to undertake the different processes without dependence on any formal institutional legal aid process. Members of the concerned community become part of the advocacy strategy, and towards that end, programs are conducted for strengthening their knowledge. Advocacy for law and policy reform is an integral part of the strategy adopted while pursuing a case with structural issues. I must also say that human rights cases have an impact only if they are followed up by constant use of positive judgments for seeking relief for other victims in order to make the benefits of strategic litigation visible. It is important to build a political constituency and political mobilization, and to demonstrate the connection between law and political change. I know that all of you know that lawyers have always had a role in restoring democracy, in using constitutional means, even in building constitutional conventions so that democracy and human rights and inclusive and participatory democracy can be achieved. I came across a quote by the governor of Kenya many decades ago, who said that it was never a good thing to promote legal education because lawyers generally become a nuisance for authoritarian rules and rulers. And this was said by a British governor of Kenya during the period that the country was under colonial rule. And he said, quoting the example of India, where lawyers were in the forefront of the independence movement, he said, in India, every lawyer is a politician, and every politician is a lawyer. So no wonder that the expanding role of the lawyers, even in the post-colonial period, was not something that many rulers and many regimes quite liked or accepted. In the post-colonial period, the process, the state building, the nation-state building process was dominated by two major themes regarding the role of law. One was the rule of law, where mostly the issues of political freedoms, of good governance, of constitutional and democratic practices were discussed, and that generally limited the influence of the rule of law. But then there was another stream and the role of law that was debated, which was the law and development discourse, where law was being used in order to ensure that not only do people enjoy fundamental freedoms, but that also their social, economic, and cultural rights are protected and their basic needs are fulfilled. This was a very narrow concept of the rule of law, and a more dynamic concept developed when the role of law came to be seen as combining the two different streams of thought. The concept of the rule of law as it existed in the post-colonial period, and the law and development approach that in many ways improved on the narrow rule of law approach. And the very dynamic concept of the rule of law then emerged, where it was recognized that the rule of law is for the expansion of not just the rights and the guarantees of rights, but the assurances that they can be realized. And this was primarily the responsibility of lawyers and jurists, so that not only civil and political rights could be safeguarded, but also to establish social, economic, educational, and cultural conditions under which a person's legitimate aspirations and dignity may be realized. The rule of law and representative government did not necessarily deal with issues of marginalization, disempowerment, disenfranchisement, denial of participation, and were often endangered by hunger, poverty, and unemployment. Therefore, a new sense of consciousness emerged within the lawyers' community, and there was more commitment in order to use their skills and techniques for the elimination of poverty, disempowerment, and marginalization. The nation-building processes and their economic models started coming under scrutiny in the post-colonial period. And the general conclusion was that the legal system helped to sustain, if not produce, structures that caused the impoverishment of large number of people, particularly in rural areas. It is in this context that access to justice became a major area of concern. The focus of the discourse was on problems faced by the poor and other marginalized sections of the society in accessing justice. The provision of legal aid to increase access of the poor and the marginalized became a major part of certain categories of lawyers in many of these countries. However, there was also the realization that the problems of legal systems in developing countries were beyond the issue of access and mere provision of legal aid. You will also notice, and it doesn't come as a surprise, that the expanding role of lawyers has a direct connection with the political and economic conditions in which people's everyday problems were emerging. For instance, if you look at the history of the past few decades, you will see that it was in the 60s and the 70s when several post-colonial countries and countries in other parts of the world witnessed authoritarian rule and justified this authoritarianism more often in the name of development. In repressive situations, the role of legal resource lawyers and organizations becomes even more important. So on the one hand, where there is political repression because of authoritarianism, there is a control over economic development, which is not informed by the basic needs theory. And people's right to not only utilize their own natural resources, but their control over their natural resources and local resources is never legitimized, which is never legitimately given to these people. And I will draw attention to some of the examples where legal resources approach movements began during authoritarian rule. For instance, the Philippines, following the 1972 martial law. Jose W. Diacono, whose work perhaps a lot of you are familiar with, he was also imprisoned under martial law, expounded the idea of development legal aid. In Indonesia, General Suharto's authoritarian regime severely restricted citizens' meaningful participation. In this context, social-minded lawyers resorted to provision of legal aid as a way of increasing access to justice for the rural and the urban poor. Since the regime restricted normal political activity, legal aid and litigation became a vehicle for challenging injustices. According to one research study of the development of this concept of structural aid in Indonesia, this became an alternative form of a political movement that, despite restrictions on political activity, strived for the inclusion of the disadvantaged into the political process and for ending unfairness and injustice. It laid the groundwork for a democratic future for Indonesia. Let me take up the case of Pakistan and the women's movement. In the 1980s, during a very oppressive military regime and its legitimization of its own unconstitutional takeover, it used Islam as the reason for derailing democracy at that time. The first targets of the Islamization process were women. And several laws came into existence which not only discriminated against women, but in many ways set back women's struggle for bringing social change and reinforced the very social mindset that women had been struggling to eliminate in order to get more progressive space for themselves, both in the political arena as well as socially in that country. It is during this period that, despite the limitations of the law, and despite the fact that if we took the narrow definition of the rule of law to mean every law means every law is a part of the concept of the rule of law. Despite those limitations, women used the courts for two purposes. There was no scope to challenge the legislation at that time. But what was possible was to use individual cases in order to sensitize the judiciary and in order to make visible the injustices of the laws by not just an abstract narrative of what was wrong with the laws, but putting a face to the injustice. A series of cases that was taken up it took time, but it had the effect of making clear to the public that the law, whatever its genesis or wherever it was derived from, was leading to gross injustice, both legally and socially for women. This ability in a restrictive environment where freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of movement was seriously restricted, made the courts into a forum where it became possible not only to speak out in legal terms and with respect to the social impact of these cases, but it became a forum where we publicized the offensive nature of these cases and how it was affecting not just one woman, but women as a class of citizens. In South Asia, I think it's important to know that it is through injustices and the inability of democratic institutions to provide the necessary protection against violations of human rights, which came not only because of commission or acts of government, but also omissions of governments. This is the environment in which the transformation of the concept of the rule of law developed, and the role of lawyers changed. Under this legal resources approach, the legal profession was seen as an agent of change and not merely as professionals representing individuals in legal forums. Lawyers and legal aid organizations began using creative ways to invoke law for advancing the rights of disadvantaged groups. Several organizations emerged in South and Southeast Asia during the 70s and the 80s that used law as a resource to protect the rights of marginalized groups and to expand access to justice. Amongst the earlier groups that emerged in the region, which I should mention, is the Consumer Association of Penang, for instance. And I mention this because during that period, there was so much restriction on establishing NGOs with a rights-based agenda that some groups used consumer organizations as a platform for carrying out legal resources-related activity. And they made a major contribution in Malaysia and across the region in advocating the use of the rule of law and courts for assisting disadvantaged groups. In India, the grassroots movements that emerged advocated for the rights of specific groups such as displaced people, fisher folk, people facing caste discrimination, and women began to actively use law and courts to advance their claims and rights. But it's not just South and Southeast Asia where authoritarianism, neglect of social, economic, and cultural rights, and inability of the state to ensure or guarantee these rights gave rise to the strategic litigation approach, or whatever using the law as a resource approach. There are experiences from other regions as well, both in terms of lawyers standing up in situations where there was extreme repression and very little avenues and channels for trying to achieve some form of justice. The lawyers provided this service to social movements and political activists and played an important role in overcoming, at least to some extent, the impact of authoritarianism. It is through their work that I can say with confidence that it became possible to control the damage and to give the hope and expectation that things can change. The role played by lawyers and legal resource organizations in contributing to the end of apartheid in South Africa is an inspiring story. Majority black population was disenfranchised during the apartheid period. Political opponents were detained indefinitely without trial. Torture and extrajudicial executions were routine and were carried out with impunity. Freedom of expression, association, and movement was severely restricted for majority of the population and for those condemning the practices of apartheid. As part of the struggle against apartheid, funds were set up to provide assistance to political prisoners facing trial. The South African Defense Aid Fund was set up in 1960. The government banned this fund in 1966. In the 70s, progressive South African lawyers and law academics began discussing how law and the courts could be used in the struggle against apartheid. The Legal Resource Center of South Africa produced amazing leadership. Many of us here today have had the privilege of knowing Arthur Chaskalson. I was even more lucky. I worked with him for some years. He later became the president of the Constitutional Court in post-apartheid South Africa. Arthur Chaskalson was the first national director of the Legal Resource Center. It is through the struggle of lawyers that many successes were achieved even during apartheid. One of the examples is the Komani case, which challenged the past laws. Then there is the Latin American experience. Several Latin American countries went through severe political crises in the 70s and the 80s. Democratically elected governments were overthrown by military regimes. These regimes severely restricted freedoms and committed gross violation of human rights, such as torture, extrajudicial killings, and disappearances. It was lawyers and NGOs focused on providing legal assistance to political prisoners and victims of human rights violations who were in the forefront in the struggle for democracy and in challenging the methods and measures adopted by these authoritarian governments. In Chile in 1973, there was a military coup. The Committee of Cooperation for Peace was set up by the Catholic Church, which provided legal aid to political prisoners that were tried by military courts. Workers were detained of this committee, and the committee was disbanded in 1975. As I narrate these examples, it is important to note that it was not something that was done without risk by these lawyers. They were constantly under threat. Several of them ended up in prison. Many were killed and disappeared because of their work for the promotion and protection of human rights and for the restoration of democracy. There is a kind of a story of resilience. One organization was banned, another one was started. So when the committee was banned in 1975, another organization was set up, the Vicariate of Solidarity, and it played a central role in not only providing support to political prisoners and victims of serious human rights violations and abuse, but also in keeping the outside world informed of the human rights situation in Chile. It tracked thousands of cases of disappearances, arbitrary arrest, and torture, filed thousands of writs of habeas corpus, provided legal assistance to detainees and prisoners, and gave humanitarian assistance to families of political prisoners. In Argentina, persons whose sons and daughters disappeared founded the Center for Legal and Social Studies in 1979. Habeas corpus petitions became documentation of crimes committed by the regime. As a result of cases filed during this period, after the return of democracy, these became the record of what happened in the past. So this was another service that was being done through litigation, documenting human rights abuse. And as a result of these cases that were filed during the period of oppression, after the return of democracy, the Supreme Court in 2005 declared amnesty-related measures as unconstitutional, consequently reopening 1,700 cases. During the course of these litigations, a very important process also started, which was the use of litigation to demand access to information. And I think it's important also to mention in particular the contribution of certain judicial institutions in some countries. In India, for instance, social action litigation was based on the Supreme Court's innovations that facilitated hitherto marginalized people from the legal system and made it possible for them to approach the court. And I would like to particularly stress the importance of certain changes which are not brought through constitutional amendments or organic law, but by a broader understanding of judiciary and judicial institutions, of the context in which they are required to give justice. If this deep understanding, not only of the environment in which they are working, but also an understanding of the role that they are required to play, is the only way in which the judiciary can do justice to their expected role. Opening up of the whole question of locus standi became very important for human rights lawyers, who not only wanted to take cases to court that related to the promotion and protection of human rights, but also were asked by human rights organizations many times to represent them. Now, as a lawyer working for women's rights, this locus standi issue is something that I confronted all the time in the earlier years till we were able to overcome the restrictions. You think of, we always keep talking about women who have become victims either at the hand of non-state or state actors, and make their vulnerability and the disadvantages they suffer because of gender discrimination and lack of opportunities. We keep talking about that, but we seldom think that it's not just enough that this woman is able to take her case to court, she must be relieved of the burden of prosecution. And I think a lot of you who have represented victims of human rights abuse, because on the one hand, admittedly, they are part of the less empowered communities. Admittedly, they suffer abuse because of this disempowerment, and yet we do not give a thought to the fact that insistence on the aggrieved person directly having the right to pursue a case will make it difficult for either an individual or a community of people who are from the disadvantaged groups. I would end by giving another example, which is more current and is an amazing story of how legal and human rights organizations bridged the gap between law and social activism and removed a lot of the mistrust between human rights people, social activists. And this is the example of the Brazilian landless workers movement, the MST. The MST is a movement of landless workers who, taking advantage of a provision of the Brazilian constitution, which says and subjects the right to property to the social use of that property. And it says that if this property is not being utilized, then the state has the right to redistribute land to those who do not have it. Taking advantage of that, this movement was built. This movement occupies land that has that is not being used for productive purposes, and then approaches the court and the administrative authorities so that the land can be acquired and redistributed. In the beginning, of course, they were called, their action was illegal, they were taken to prisons, and there were administrative actions against them. It was through the combined efforts of lawyers and social activists that has ended. And there are, and the political repression and antagonism that was coming even from the courts at that time ended. In 1996, Brazil's highest court ruled that land occupations intended to accelerate reform were distinct from criminal acts against property, thereby legitimizing this and giving it a legitimate status of social action rather than a criminal act. Now, as I was hearing some comments in some of yesterday's sessions, it is not possible to promote and protect human rights unless the whole scope of international human rights standards is broadened. Many of us belong to the countries where we have a dualist system, and even where states have ratified international human rights instruments, they cannot become a part of the domestic administration of justice unless domestic laws, they are brought into the domestic laws. However, I do believe, despite what some of the judges I heard saying yesterday, I do believe that this strict divide has in some ways not broken down, but it's on its way to being bridged. And principles now have been formulated to guide judges on the application of international human rights norms at the domestic level. For instance, in 1998, it was Commonwealth judges at a conference called by the Commonwealth Secretariat in Bangalore that the Bangalore Principles developed. The principles did not and in no way authorize backdoor incorporation of treaties or customary law, but recommended that courts might find them useful since they express universal principles of human rights. Quoting from the words of the principles, it is within the proper nature of the judicial process and well-established judicial functions for national courts to have regard to international obligations which a country undertakes, whether or not they have been incorporated into domestic law, for the purpose of removing ambiguity or uncertainty from national institutions or common law. I may also mention that one of the other good examples of, from the South Asian countries more recently of social action litigation was in Bangladesh, where human rights organizations and lawyers had challenged the ability of local courts to give fatwas, and as a part of these fatwas, extrajudicial sentences were being handed out. Women were being lashed, couples were being given sentences of whipping for immorality, and the Bangladesh Supreme Court held that this particular practice was not allowable. And saying, in this judgment also said that courts should use the standards prescribed in different human rights treaties as aids to interpret the rights guaranteed in the Constitution. Thus, if domestic law is not clear, the courts should look into the principles developed under international law to determine if there is or has been a violation of rights or not. There is another area in which we still have to struggle as human rights lawyers to create better space for the fulfillment of guarantees of social, economic, and cultural rights that we see in international instruments. In most countries in the Commonwealth, especially in South Asian region, while civil and political rights are accepted and recognized as fundamental rights, most of the social, cultural, and economic rights are only a part of principles of policy. We are going in the direction of getting better judgments where the scope for the enforceability of social, economic, and cultural rights is becoming possible, both in India and in Pakistan, and I'm sure in other countries, but I'm more familiar with these two countries. There have been judgments from the highest courts saying that social, economic, and cultural rights are enforceable because in many cases they are a part of the right to life, because the right to life is not limited to prevention of death. It also means a quality of life. It is these rights and their fulfillment is connected very closely to the very core right of human dignity. I hope that some of the examples of the social movements that I have just discussed have been able to show that law can be invoked as a part of a larger mobilization process. Laws have been used as an integral part of political struggle, and they must be used as a part of these political struggle and cannot bring positive change if used in isolation. Using notions of justice and constitutionalism, efforts should be made to expand existing jurisprudence, including the gender dimensions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You actually did speak right up to the bell, but if we've got perhaps a couple of minutes for a couple of questions, if anybody has one. We have two microphones here. Yes, sir. Would you like to just come over either here or there?
Naganand from India. It was very interesting listening to you, madam, about all your experiences. But I just want to draw your attention to two aspects. I think the achievement of political rights and civil rights through a court process, the bedrock is an independent judiciary. If you don't have that, we heard about the Bangladesh trials yesterday. There's no purpose served at all in a judiciary which has no backbone. So I think it is important for us to emphasize and talk about the importance of the independence of the judiciary. And we would be delighted to hear about your experience in Pakistan on this aspect. The second is the social, political, and cultural rights. These, even if you have an independent judiciary, it's always a problem of resources. Like in India, we have a new Right to Education Act, which guarantees free education for all children. But practically, it's not being achieved because the government is not in a position to give enough resources for this. What exactly do you perceive as the court's role in that when you find that, well, it is accepted that these rights are there and should be guaranteed and we should try to achieve it, but there are constraints of how much money the state can lay out towards that? Where does the balance lie? And what role do the courts have in that? Can the court give a direction to say, well, you keep aside so much money for this achievement of this right? I think there's a serious issue there because the parliaments and the government have their own budgets and they have their own constraints. So to what extent, in your view, could courts interfere and make this rights really achievable and realistic for the poorest sections of the society? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, it'll take me a whole day to answer all your questions, but very good questions indeed. Firstly, the whole question of whether attainment, being able to get justice depends very much on the independence of the judiciary. Absolutely, I agree with you. In my experience as litigating for the rights of the marginalized communities, as well as for women, I know that our traditional notion of the independence of judiciary has to be expanded. It's not just that the judiciary should be independent of the executive or influence of the more powerful classes. The judiciary, to be truly independent, has to rise beyond social prejudices. The judges are a part of our communities and our society, so I don't expect them to eliminate these prejudices, but they must rise beyond in order to do justice. That's one question. My experience of judicial independence in Pakistan, of course, is not very, very positive. Even when we as lawyers stood up against the actions of a military ruler, against the Supreme Court Chief Justice at that time, we were not supporting one Chief Justice. We stood up for the institution, but very clearly giving the message to the judiciary also that while lawyers have fought for a long time for judicial independence will never come only from our struggles. It will only come if the judiciary decides to become independent. So, and also when we, in many ways, say that, you know, this is a great struggle for the judicial independence that we had in Pakistan, we also had some negative fallouts of that. Judicial independence does not mean judicial dictatorship. The judiciary, truly independent judiciary, will always respect separation of powers. Truly independent judiciary will always respect the right of other democratic institutions to strengthen themselves and to play their role in the building of democracy. So, yes, I do believe that attainment of rights is quite dependent, but not solely dependent on judicial independence, because we, coming from countries where judiciaries are not necessarily known for their independence, have achieved certain victories in legal battles for rights. Now, you are talking about social, cultural, and economic rights, and you're talking about the whole question of resources and how can courts order governments to spend money on one thing and not on another. It is true that in our constitution, and I'm sure in the Indian constitution as well, some of the social, economic, and cultural rights are a part of the principles of policies whose enforcement is dependent on the availability of resources. However, coming from this region, not only as a citizen of a country in this region, but also as a lawyer, I know it's not a question of availability of resources. It's a question of allocation of resources. And how do you do it in a wise and just manner? And this is what the Indian Supreme Court, in some ways, has grappled with in the whole case about the right to food, where it has created this continuous mandamus and the creeping jurisdiction, where the case goes on and a series of orders are given and the court monitors the progress made by governments to ensure that this right is being progressively attained by the people. Under the right to food litigation, the commission was set up, and that commission reports to the court what progress has been made, where there are weaknesses, what is gaining strength in terms of administrative measures and executive action for this particular right. They also recommend, not to the court, but generally make recommendations on what kind of law and policy reform needs to be undertaken. I think, and in Pakistan this has happened to a much less success in the case of the disappearances, where commissions were formed, and through these, the court then kept the case alive in order to monitor, as the court says or claims, what governments are doing. Not much success there, but in this, I'm rather impressed by the right to food case that is going on in the Supreme Court. I don't know if Indian lawyers want to comment on that.
Thank you very much. In fact, we have run out of time, really, if we're going to keep on our schedule for the rest of the day. It's been a very substantial, very interesting, very deep talk with a great number of experiences that you've been able to bring to us. So I'd like to thank you, Ms. Jilani, for an excellent address.